you very much for inviting me. I have to say I was rather surprised because I put in 2 talk proposals for EclipseCon, and one dealt with open source software in academia, and I'm still an academic at the University of Cambridge. And that one, which I personally found not so exciting, that was selected for presentation. And the one where I'm a little bit of a geek, the IoT one, that was declined, and I was told I should apply again. But then Benjamin said, well, you know, if you're going to come down to Toulouse anyway, why not come to the IoT Meetup and do your Node-RED talk? So today I'm going to tell you very little about the Internet of Things, because I assume that if you come to an IoT Meetup, you already have a very basic concept of what it means to connect things to the Internet. And because I've already spoken for quite a while this morning, I'm also not going to do a lengthy introduction. So let's just say my name is Boris Adrian. You can find me on Twitter, and I make things learn. So just imagine a stage in the future. You have one clean shirt left. Your washing machine knows that you've already used 98% powder that you last purchased. It's Wednesday evening, 5 minutes to midnight. The last 4 Thursdays, you had a business meeting in the morning. So you probably agree that there might be a need. And if you don't get the hint, there's the need for the new shirt. The car is parked 20 meters away from a shop, and your last retail activity, according to your credit card, was 8 seconds ago. So you count 1 and 1 together. Your car near a shop, you just shopped, you must be awake and alive. This is now a very appropriate time to remind you to go shopping and get that washing powder home. Okay? So this is what my company tries to do in the future. However, things are not as easy as they seem. While from a purely informatics data science perspective, learning from such a series of events is easy, the technical implementation can be an utter pain in the arse. So, for the scenario that I just showed you, just as a very crude simplification, think that the clothes hanger that reported that there is no shirt is connected to a Raspberry Pi. In order to query the credit card activity, I had to connect to Visa through some sort of complicated API. I needed to mangle JSON, I needed to mangle XML, I had to do HTTP requests, both GET and POST. I might have used MQTT for some sort of messaging. And soon you realize that even sending a text, which you do every day, is not as simple for a computer, because you need to train up in the APIs, and you need to train up how to use the syntax, etc., etc. And that is rather painful. So I always say the computational inference, the actual problem that I showed in the last slide is easy, but the data plumbing is not. And this is where Node-RED is going to come in. So Node-RED is an open source product developed by IBM, and it's a visual tool to really give us tools so we can work on our business model and think about what the Internet of Things might be able to make possible, while taking the pain away from all these technicals of the data, and then report it and respond. And today I'm going to show you a couple of things essentially are in the background of Node-RED. A couple of I have used Node-RED in the past. And then after a short refreshment break, we're going to do hands-on exercises that I have developed for a bunch of 12-year-olds. So I'm fairly certain that everyone will be, and you will get your first impression of how it is to use Node-RED in your own web browser and to visually create data flows. So thinking about a good business logic is hard enough. You don't need to make it any more difficult by dealing with technicalities. The flow of information is that what really counts. It's the flow of information that decides you, or that differentiates you as a software developer from somebody who does a quick implementation. So we want to avoid the data plumbing problem, but also this is not a tool for essentially the final deployment. This is really meant for rapid prototyping to see whether your idea would in principle work. Somebody put it very nicely in a blog post. They said, Node-RED, it takes the crap out of the development because you can really think about what you would like to do with all of your sensors and I don't know, different switches you have in the house without having to concentrate on how exactly technically you can flick the switch. So Node-RED is a web service, and it's written in Node.js. If you are not interested in any of that, don't worry, because Node-RED really runs in a web browser. It has a very nice GUI, and you don't really have to include Node.js that it's built upon, but you can if you want to. So there are modules that you can take from, and you can already with a large library of complementary tools that are packaged with your initial install, or different functionalities available that you can download from various websites, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples. What's interesting is that your flows that you create can easily be shared, because the internal representation of a Node-RED flow is just a JSON string, and you can very easily copy and paste it into an email, send it to somebody else, and they can use it. As I said, it's browser-based flow editing, so it is advantageous if you know a little bit of JavaScript, but if you don't, you can still use Node-RED. There are a couple of different nodes. So we have data nodes, data transformations, JSON to XML, XML to JSON, that sort of thing. We have interaction with social media. We can listen to the Twitter flow. We can send tweets. We can retrieve emails. We can send emails. We can send texts. We can connect to databases. There is all sorts of networking functionality. And depending on what system you use, you can interact directly with the hardware. So, for example, if you're using Node-RED on a PC, you might just be able to use a USB-connected device and use any documented functionality if somebody has written a node for Node-RED. On a Raspberry Pi, you can address all of these GPIO pins and use it in any sort of embedded application. And there are a couple of data analysis nodes. They're in there mostly for entertainment purposes, I'd say. So there's flows library. So very in appreciation of the openness, of the open source of Node-RED, people very often develop very useful flows. For example, if the light level outside drops below a certain brightness, then switch on my hue light, that sort of thing. And there's a library of flows that people have already committed, and you can very easily just browse them at flows.node-red.org and see what people have done and whether you can use that for your own purposes. So that's very nice. So I'm going to show you the first demo now. So as in every programming language, the first thing that we're going to do is hello world.
Boris, don't forget to start Node-RED before you click start.
You said that last time, but in fact, Node-RED has been running since quite a while, So you can invoke it from the command line on your computer. So I suppose if you're working on a Linux or Mac OS based system, you would just invoke it from the command line. On Windows, I honestly don't know. And very often, if you find Node-RED really useful, it might actually run as a service by default on your machine. So you don't have to worry about starting it up or not. So what you see here is a couple of status messages telling me that the Node-RED server is already running on my system and is happy. So I will now change into my web browser, and I've pointed it to localhost. So localhost is the IP address of my very own computer. And on port 1880, Node-RED's waiting to be called up. And this is what your first impression of Node-RED is going to be. So what we have here along this panel is all of these different nodes that I was previously talking about. So here we have input nodes. We can inject a message. We can listen to an MQTT feed. We can listen to HTTP. We can interact with the serial port of this computer, etc., etc. There's the same things for output. Then there are various function nodes that I'm going to show you. This is interaction with social media or email. And well, I haven't installed any of the nodes that would interact with databases, for example. But here, just as the very generic installation, I would have the option to save information to file and write it to disk. But I told you I was just going to do an inject of a message here. So I have an input node, and by default, it would inject the current timestamp in Unix format. And I'm going to take a debug node. Now, the debug just means that it'll show me some information. It doesn't have this implicit connotation of already having done a mistake, and you have to debug. So we're going to connect the inject node and the debug node. I enable the debug window. And by double-clicking on the inject node, I can now edit its properties. So here in that case, I say I'd like to inject a string, and the string is going to be hello world. Now I deploy that flow. So now what I've just created by just simply drawing a program is running as a program. And I can trigger the activity of this node by just clicking on this tab here. And out here in my debug pane comes hello world. And it even tells me that there was a payload coming in of the data type string, and it's hello world. So that line that I had been drawing that connected the inject node to the debug node, that essentially means that I messaged between the two different nodes. And intrinsically, every message has a topic and a payload. And those of you who have been doing IoT a little bit longer will recognize that this is essentially following the specification of the MQTT protocol that's quite frequently used in IoT conversations between devices. So I always say the similarity could be intentional, but in fact, both have been invented in IBM laboratories. So some conclusions. Now, you can extend a message because ultimately the message that you're sending is really just a JavaScript object. And while by default, most of them have just a topic and a payload, you can add a lot of other stuff. And in fact, in the exercises today, we're going to have an entire HTTP response object that will tell one of the nodes how to get back to a query through a website. that we will add as an additional information to such a message. So I'm going to show you another demo. So I drew this up earlier. It's already deployed, since I didn't change it since my last round of deployment. And you can see I have a couple of inject nodes. So in this one here, I've set a payload and a topic. So the payload is a string, and it has the value orange, and the topic is color. Here in this case, I have a payload, which is a string and is orange, but it has the topic fruit. And I spare you the other nodes, but here in this case, I just set the topic to fruit, but I don't give it any payload. And in the lower two cases, Apple and Ferrari, I give it a payload, but no topic. Okay? So let's have a look at this node here. So you can see that all of these nodes, when triggered with the mouse, would send their message, for example, to this node here. I called that node look at the topic. And when I double click, what I see is that there's a very easy graphical user interface where it says, well, if message.topic, that's how also in JavaScript how you would address that particular field. If that equals fruit, then continue on output 1. If it is color, continue on output 2. And if it's something else, continue on output number 3. Now let's have a look where this leads to. So output number 1 here is fruit, I would set the payload of the message then to you chose a fruit. So I'm discarding the information that was previously in payload, and I'm replacing that with something else. Here on output number 2, I changed my payload to you chose a color. And on output number 3, I'm not sure what you chose. Okay? So let me just show that to you. I click here. I meant color orange. You chose a color. Very well. I click here. You chose a fruit. And it may not come as too much as of a surprise if I click here. I'm not sure what you chose. So, of course, I cannot only look at the payload. I can also I cannot only look at the topic of a message. I can also look at the payload. So that's what I do here. But for reasons of simplicity and principle, I'm just looking for a substring error. Okay? So if I'm going to inject error in it, then I'm going to get an output on my output number 1. Otherwise, I won't do anything. Now I click on Ferrari, and I hope you see the error. We have a car. Of course, what happens is that we go into here, and I say, again, purely through the GUI, not using a single line of JavaScript, search for Ferrari and replace it with car. So there would have been quite a few alternatives. I could have used a module, and we are going to use these quite frequently in the later exercise, where I take the message and I manually overwrite the properties of my object. But sometimes you don't even have to do it that complicated. You can just use the GUI and get these things done. So my third and I think last example, and I hope the wireless is friendly to me, is this introduction of a new flow through a JSON string. So I copy-pasted that string from the Node-RED website where they used this as a demo. And I might not even know what it does. Well, of course I know what it does, but I can simply just take that, copy it into the clipboard, then I'd go to Node-RED, I'd say import from clipboard, and that would paste that JSON string into my current workflow. And this is what I would get. Essentially, some sort of event, here in that case tick, and just for the fun of it, this time I don't want to click a button. This time I say, in an interval of every 10 seconds, do a GET request from a website. So this is a rather lengthy URL. This is one of these JavaScript editing nodes that I was telling you about. So I would then, from the HTTP that comes back, just extract the string demand and frequency. So this is going to be information about, and then I can output two different messages, and it go to these two different debug nodes. So I deploy that. Now we have to wait a couple of seconds, and if my eduroam connection is still valid, we should hopefully see an output in a second. Da-da-da! So one node said, well, demand is 36,000 something, frequency is 49.97. I think that's the frequency of the energy network. That's less than, I was told it's supposed to be 50, so being at 49.97 is actually not that good. So that's why the Boolean value that I'm also giving out through the second debug node is false, otherwise it would have been true. And I'll just kill that off. So that's the sort of things you can do with Node-RED. But of course, we want to do IoT. For those purposes, already last year, I made an interoperability test where I said, given the devices that Node-RED has, how easy is it to put data into different data platforms? And I don't know how many of you have already tried storing data into these kind of like public platforms. But there is Xively, which is quite prominent. There is UBDots, there is ThingSpeak, there are plenty of those. And I systematically tested all of them, and at that URL published a guide as to how you would use Node-RED in order to take any sort of data and put it onto your data platform. So my test flow that I used back then, essentially I had an AirPi mounted on a Raspberry Pi. The AirPi is a shield that has two different temperature sensors, a humidity sensor, sensors for CO2 and nitric oxide, the noise level, which is usually high in our house, and it can also take information from a GPS module if you want to travel around and take data at different sites. So that essentially was queried by a Python script, which I did not develop. But it outputted data via UDP. Now I just used the Node-RED UDP input node, listened to the UDP stream, split the message into different parts, and then sent the same data to iHop, Exosite, UBDots, Imam CMS, etc., all these different data portals. and I documented how well they would really cover my data, etc. What I'm showing there in the corner was my test readout. So the setup in my house is in a way that the temperature and humidity data automatically then generate an HTML page, and you can reuse a NUC ebook reader as a wireless display. And so that was the general setup. There are a couple of sort of like, I'd call them, so essentially because the AirPi software didn't run very stable at the time, it rebooted a Raspberry Pi every 24 hours at midnight. It would take, this is the part that takes care of the web server, and would also give me a little bit of diagnostics. So just as an example, I have a collect messages flow. So many of these data platforms, they don't like it if you make too many connections. So rather than sending every one of my 10 different sensors every time I take a measurement every 15 seconds as individual data points, I always had to collect the data from all 10 different sensors until I had them together and then push over the entire package to, for example, Xively. So this is the little bit of JavaScript here that I needed in order to only really initiate the transmission once all of the sensors had given me their reading. And effectively, all I needed to know to put the data on the IoT platform here in that case is the IP address that they used for their MQTT input, the port, which is the MQTT standard port 1883, and a device key that you get by visiting their website. And then I had to create a topic, and all of my data was then put underneath that topic. And it was not much different from most of the other data platforms. So taking a measurement, doing some sort of processing, and then putting it on an IoT platform is extremely simple with Node. So that's another example. As I said, there are nodes for all purposes, all sorts of. So for example, you can create quite complicated HTML pages as effectively you can auto-generate HTML. So here in that case, for example, I'd render some data and overlay the heat map onto Google Maps, all through essentially modifying some HTML and some JavaScript inside the output capability of Node-RED. So show of hands, who knows Minecraft? It's disappointingly few, but essentially if you have children like, between 6 and probably 12, Minecraft is the only thing you will hear. And so effectively you can run a person through a brick world and do stuff. Now, of course, I want to interest my children in writing programs and stuff. So what I essentially developed was an interface that would take data from a Node-RED flow and send an MQTT stream to my Raspberry Pi, and that would then be translated into movement in the Minecraft world. So that's the Node-RED flow that could run anywhere really in your local network. And I had the commands left, forwards, backwards, right that I can use to make the little figure move. I use Mosquito as my MQTT broker. And then at the Raspberry Pi, I used Eclipse Paho, do you hear? to then take that MQTT message, and I parse out whether I want to walk forward, backward, left, or right. I have a couple of callbacks that are translated then into movements for the Minecraft API. So in principle, you can connect Minecraft to the IoT.
Just for completeness, Mosquito is also Eclipse Mosquito, actually.
Is it?
Yes, it is.
How could I forget that?
Maybe you just didn't know. No problem.
So, there is already an abundance of different when you have your first installation of Node-RED. So I told you that there is the inject node, there is MQTT. You can create and listen to WebSockets. You can have serial connections. You can have connections, UDP connections, etc., etc. The function node, that's the node where you can write actual JavaScript and say, do this or that with the incoming information. There's the template node, which is the one that I would use in order to auto-generate HTML pages. I can introduce a delay. I can simply switch and change info. That's the stuff in my second demo. I can do email, Twitter, IRC, etc., 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 etc. But what if there's just not the right node for me? Well, assume that people already have had the same problem that you have, and these days you can find anything. So for example, there's a swear filter. So the payload goes to the swear filter, and if it should find any words that you wouldn't mention in front of your children, except when you're me, then you use the swear filter because it replaces those words. There are nodes for particular pieces of hardware that you can buy. So for example, the Wemo sockets are internet-connected power sockets that you can remotely switch on or off. And you can just take the Wemo node, put it into Node-RED, and do something with it. Or, for example, there's a calculator that, given your approximate geographic coordinates, can tell you the time of sunset and sunrise, which can be quite relevant if you're developing lighting solutions. When I last checked, and that must have been probably about 2 days ago, there were 242 different nodes on NPM. So NPM is a sort of like library for Node.js packages. And when you install Node.js in order to install Node-RED, you get automatically the sort of like package manager. So you'd go to NPM and you say, like, I'm interested in this and that sort of functionality for Node-RED, and sure as hell, you're going to find something which you can then very easily, with a simple command line operation, install and use in your next application. So if you're curious what these nodes actually are, you can drill down in the file hierarchy of your Node-RED installation. And what you will find is that there is a collection of nodes. And every node has an HTML page, an HTML file, and a .js, a JavaScript file. The HTML takes care of the dialogues that you see when you double-click the node. And in the JavaScript, you define the functionality. So here, in that case, this is really just a very simple proof of principle. It's the lowercase node. So imagine you can input any sort of character string, but it returns all the characters definitely in lowercase. There is the HTML, which is actually a lot longer than the JavaScript that then provides the functionality. So we define that this node is in the function category, so that would define at which position in this side panel our node is going to appear. By default, there's nothing in it, because we can give the nodes names just for easier recognition in our flow. Here, in that case, the default name is going to be empty. We define that this node is going to have exactly one input and one output. And there is an icon which is then shown next to your node description, Again, just for easier visual representation. And here, in that case, it very much says, show a form that says name, and you can enter a name if you want to. And just keep in mind that, or save the information of the name that this node is going to have. The JavaScript file then effectively just has this event. So if there is something coming from the input, message.payload becomes message.payload.toLowercase. That's essentially the magic. And then node.send returns that information, that message, to the output node. Now, between this .on and node.send, you could do whatever you want. You can listen to your hardware. You can call up external scripts. You can interact with other websites, whatever you want to do. So Node-RED had a pretty good name, but some people considered it a toy. I think probably at some stage 80% of all Node-RED installations were on Raspberry Pis. And of course, as an IBM product, what you want to be known for, right? Now, IBM have a platform as a service. It's called Bluemix. So effectively, you can buy compute power from IBM and deploy your software on their servers. It's not like getting root access to a machine. It's more or less, this is my JavaScript, this is my Java program, just run it. I won't go into the deployment mechanisms because that's a talk in itself. But what's important to know is that Node-RED has become one of their boilerplates. So what that means is that if you start up a Bluemix project, you can say, I want to have a Bluemix project on the basis of Node-RED. So rather than going into the really more complicated solutions like deploying a web service on the basis of Java, etc., you can say, I'd like to do something with Node-RED. So these are other functionalities you can have on Bluemix these days. So connections to really enterprise scale databases, for example, to big data analytics, all that stuff. By the way, I'm not being paid by IBM. So that was really just for information purposes. Yeah, and so that's like the sort of dashboard that you see. Like here in that case, at this particular time, I had an Apache server running and something had stopped, probably was broken, and then there was my Node-RED. Now, my Node-RED had a URL. Here in that case, it was at an IoT conference, and essentially if you went to iotconf.mybluemix.net at that time, you would have seen an application. So at that URL, so there used to be a live demo, but I didn't know about the quality of the internet here. So you're only going to get screenshots. If you would go to that URL and say /red, then you would see the development GUI, very much what you otherwise see if you have it running locally on your own machine and you just go to localhost port 1880. So what I would do is I would listen to the Twitter hosts. I update a word count, so I was just looking with a few regular expressions whether certain words were mentioned. And then if an HTTP request would come in, I'd combine that information in order to show a website. So here in that case, now you note that I've replaced /red, which presented me with the development GUI, with Twitter words, which is then the name of the web service I wanted to expose. It would then say, well, I've counted 223 tweets, the last tweet on IoT was Estimode putting beacons in yada yada yada. And at that stage, no tweet had mentioned Node-RED, IoTConf, Nick O'Leary, or myself. And that's, of course, very convenient because you don't want to listen to the Twitter hosts from your Raspberry Pi in your living room. Your ISP might not be very happy about that. But to have that running in the cloud, it's not really much of a problem anymore. So things have moved on. And I should warn you, because Bluemix is a paid-for service. IBM is not going to give you anything for free but Node-RED. So there's a French project called the ThingBox, which is essentially a Raspberry Pi SD card image that when you put it onto your SD card, put it into the Raspberry Pi, it automatically comes with a particular flavor of Node-RED. Then there is OctoBlue from an author who has at least a French name. And what he's done effectively is he replaced this generic Node-RED layout by probably more fancy pictures. And then since recently, in the non-French speaking part of Canada, there is a company called SenseTech, and they have FRED. And FRED stands for Front End for Node-RED. And you can essentially, for free, create your Node-RED on their servers, and even deploy web services. Again, without the pain of having to deal with settings in your own house if you want to provide a simple website, that sort of thing. So this is always my last Node-RED slide, and I cannot really print the thank you big enough. So this is Nick O'Leary and Dave. They are the two authors of Node-RED, and they are the ones who essentially told IBM that this should be an open source project, so that really everyone can use it, everyone can adjust it to their needs. And I think they really deserve a lot of respect for that. We can have a break, beer and snacks, and then we can, whoever's interested, go through these hands-on exercises that are based around the idea that most people use websites, only few people know what's actually going on in terms of the messaging, of who has to talk to whom. And that Node-RED flow builds or represents a very basic chat server that two people with two different browsers can connect to and exchange information. And that is really just meant as a general introduction into flow-based programming. It has nothing to do with IoT really, but I didn't want to bring all my IoT kit in a suitcase from England. And I think as a sort of like proof of principle, that's going to be probably good enough. And if anyone has any gadgets with them, like, maybe we can even connect them. Okay, thank you.